So finally, we want to ask a question in terms of voting. Whom do we vote for when we vote? Like, what are some general trends that we see? And the first one we start with is, again, a reminder that California may be different than the rest of the country or at the federal level, is in California, we vote for Democrats. And we will see when we talk about the legislature and the executive branch and the subsequent chapters that over two-thirds majority of the California Assembly and are Democrats. And so it is the case that here in California, we generally have much greater support for Democrats than for Republicans. At the national level, it's a little more complicated. The Democrats control the majority of the House of Representatives, but the Republicans control a majority of the U.S. Senate and the President of the United States. And so we have divided government in the federal level, and at the California level, we have united government and unified government in the sense that Democrats control the legislature and the executive branch, and therefore can institute and put forward the policies that they want and to try the things that they want. But in a broader sense, we want to figure out what are some forces that influence how people decide how to evaluate candidates. Since the 1950s, and back then, in 1960, the American Voter came out, and that study is 700 pages long. I've read it to my graduate seminar, and it's really boring for them. But they did isolate three factors that can influence how people vote for candidates, how they assess candidates, and who they decide to vote for. And those are the policies that are put forward by the candidates, like what are the policies that they would advocate for and put into place if they could do so. The other is the political party of the candidate. And finally is the personality characteristics of the candidates themselves. And so those are the three forces, the three major influences on how people decide who they vote for. And those have remained the three main forces. There have been some changes in terms of the priority to be more important, but they are ones that since the 1960 have been the major determinants of how people decide to vote. And what we want to think about first is, what should it be? What is the ranking that we should have if we're thinking about this in terms of a democratic republic? What fits the idea of democracy better when you have representative government? How should people put those forces together? And the main thing would be is that number one should be policy. What are the positions put forward by this candidate in terms of the policies that they would put forward and would vote for or vote against? And so that we would know what are the set of policies that this individual is going to implement should they be able to the legislature or as the President of the United States. And so number one should be the policy. Number two in democratic theory would be party ID. As Dr. Haas pointed out, party ID can be used as a shortcut, a heuristic, for us to predict what candidates are going to do for issues we don't know. But if they're part of a political party, even if it's a two-party system, we get a sense, at least somewhat, of what sort of approach a Democrat or Republican is going to take in terms of a whole range of issues. And so number two on the list would be the party ID. And finally, a distant third in democratic theory would be the image of the candidate, the kind of personality characteristics. Would you want to go to their barbecue? Are they a fun person to hang out with? Those sort of things that people often use should be final, should be number three. You should use policy first, second party ID, and then a very distant third would be these individual personality characteristics of the candidate running for office. So what do we actually see? What we actually see in reality when we take a look at how people are influenced, the number one influence on how people vote is party ID. And that goes to that point we had made earlier, which is to say that even though the majority of the plurality, the biggest number of people are independents. 40% of Americans say that they don't believe in any political party, that they're part of a third party or something like that. So that's 40% of the electorate. About 30% are in favor of Democrats, about 30% are in favor of Republicans, and those numbers can change, but generally speaking, that's what it tends to be. But if you add together the Democrats and the Republicans, those individuals who use their party ID to decide which candidate to vote for, that's 60%. So that is a majority of the ID. Half of them use Republican Party ID to decide who they evaluate, and half use Democratic Party ID, but both of them are using their Party ID. So a majority of Americans use Party ID as the main way in which they decide which candidate they're going to vote for. It is a shortcut. So especially if you know you can just vote for the Democrat straight down the line or Republican straight down the line, it makes your job a lot easier, as many of you suggested, in terms of, well, it would be a lot harder if you move to a PR voting system, because then we'd actually have to pay attention to these different parties and things like that. So it is a shortcut to say you're a Democrat and then vote only for Democrats, or to say you're a Republican and vote only for Republicans. But we also see that for 40% of Americans, a large number, they don't want to use that. And then the next on the list is the personality of the candidates. And then the distant third is, what are the policies that are put forward? And so what we have is a very different ranking than what we would like in the theory of democracy. In the theory of democracy, we'd like policy positions to be number one. In reality, it's number three. Party ID plays an important role in both theory and in practice. Tends to be a little bit more than it should be, because it's the number one force in terms of how people actually use it. But theoretically, it does make some sense, because there is a recognition that political parties do help to narrow down choices a little bit. And the final one, in terms of what should be, is actually number two on the list for what is, and that is the policy positions taken by the candidate. The final one is the personality of the candidates. It should be number three, but it tends to be number two on the list in terms of how people actually use it. Finally, we want to ask a question about, does it matter who votes? And since this is social science, we have both answers. We have both yes and no. Let's start with the no. Does it matter who votes? People argue it doesn't matter, because one vote doesn't determine an election. In this way, it's saying that even though there can be really close elections, even though technically they can be tied, that's why you need to have a majority is 50% plus one or greater. You need to break the tie. One vote could make a difference. One vote doesn't make a difference, because the electorate is still too big, right? In that sense, and it's really pointing to an idea of elections, that if you vote only because your vote is the thing that determines who gets elected, looking at elections wrong, because that will not happen. Even in local elections with a very small number of people voting, it is rare that it's going to be decided by only one vote. Well, then it doesn't matter who votes. The other is to argue that the voters and non-voters, if they're basically the same, then it doesn't matter who votes. Because if the voters look like the non-voters, or the non-voters aren't that different than the voters, it shouldn't matter. But we already know that the non-voters are very different. The non-voters tend to be younger. They tend to be larger percentage of our minorities. They tend to be lower income. And in many ways, the priorities set by younger minorities, lower income, with lower levels of education, are a very different set of priorities than those who vote. And so that argument is one that you can make theoretically, but doesn't seem to hold up to any scrutiny. But then those who argue that it does matter who votes really point out a fundamental difference in terms of what elections are. It's a viewpoint that elections are not simply determining who gets elections. In and of themselves are important, because it allows us to check into our political system, to find out what other people are thinking, to engage in this set of compromises and deliberation that true democracy and democratic republic demands. And so it does matter if we have a large percentage of people not voting. It is a problem if a certain set of people aren't participating, because their voices aren't heard. We know that it matters who votes, and because the vicious cycle of political participation. If people don't vote and politicians continue to ignore those groups, then they will be less likely to vote in the future. And so this low level of political participation is going to continue. It creates a disenchantment from the political system. It creates a sense of apathy, a sense of lack of concern and connectedness with our government and with perhaps even other people. And the other is that it does, especially as we start to see it, you have real challenges to if you want to have popular sovereignty, you need to have us engaged in the process. And even if our candidate doesn't win, we need to be part of the debate and the discussion.